I was 3 pages into reviewing a quarterly asset performance report when my phone lit up on the kitchen counter. The screen glowed with the family group text, messages piling up faster than usual. I almost ignored it. These threads were usually Brenna planning another brunch or my father-in-law forwarding political cartoons nobody asked for. But something about the timing felt off. I set down my highlighter and picked up the phone with one hand, still holding my coffee in the other. The newest message wasn't text. It was a screenshot. From a different group chat. One I wasn't in. Brenna's name sat at the top, her message clear and sharp, she's basically decorative. Dead weight. Good thing Weston handles the real money face with tears of joy, below it, 3 laughing emojis from my sister-in-law Kimber, and a thumbs up from Weston's brother, Dorian. My stomach didn't drop. My hands didn't shake. I just stared at the screen for a long moment, watching the dots appear as someone started typing a frantic correction. I took a screenshot of the screenshot before anyone could delete it. Then I set my phone face down and went back to highlighting the paragraph I'd been reading about bond reallocation percentages. The coffee had gone lukewarm, but I drank it anyway, tasting nothing. The panic started 6 minutes later. Delete that. Wrong chat. Ignore that, Maris. You know how Brenna jokes. The messages came in fast, overlapping, contradicting each other. Kimber sent a string of crying laughing emojis like this was all some hilarious misunderstanding. Dorian typed, yikes, and nothing else. My mother-in-law, Lenora, wrote something about context and tone not translating over text. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I opened my laptop and navigated to the folder I'd been maintaining for over a year. I saved the screenshot to a folder on my laptop that had been sitting on my desktop since my first year of marriage. The folder name was simple, boring even, documentation, Alder family. I opened it and dropped the new image in with the others. There were already 11 files inside, organized by date and category. Gala recording. Expense irregularities. Foundation receipts. Prior incidents. Each one had been saved quietly, methodically, without drama or confrontation. This wasn't the first time they'd called me useless. It was just the first time they'd been careless enough to put it in writing. I closed the folder and returned to my report. The numbers didn't lie, even when people did. The oldest file in that folder was from 14 months earlier. A voice memo from a charity gala where Lenora had stood at the podium, champagne glass in hand, and made a joke that landed like a slap. The room had been full of donors, art collectors, people who wrote checks with too many zeros to count. Women in designer gowns. Men in custom tuxedos. The kind of people who measure success in foundations named after them. She'd tapped the microphone and smiled that practiced smile she used for cameras. Maris is so lucky, she'd said, pausing for effect. Married into all this and retired before 30. The crowd laughed. Not mean laughter, just polite amusement. But I'd heard what it was underneath. The suggestion that I hadn't earned my place. That I was decorative. Ornamental. A trophy wife without the athletic achievements to justify the trophy. I'd been standing near the coat check with my phone tucked in my clutch, recording. Not because I was angry in that moment, but because I'd learned something important about the Alder family in my first year of marriage. They believed their own stories more than they believed paperwork. And one day, I knew I'd need proof of what they really thought. The recording quality wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough. Clear enough for what I'd eventually need it for. That night, after the gala, I told Weston it bothered me. We were back in our penthouse, his tie already loosened, shoes kicked off by the door. The city glittered below us through floor-to-ceiling windows. He'd kissed my forehead the way you kiss a child who's worried about thunder. "Don't be sensitive," he'd said, pouring himself a drink from the crystal decanter his parents had given us as a wedding gift. "They don't understand what you do. And honestly, you don't have to do anything. You're taken care of." He'd meant it as comfort. Like being taken care of was the goal. Like I should be grateful for the luxury of irrelevance. I'd nodded and smiled and let him think he'd reassured me. Then I stayed awake after he fell asleep, transferring the audio file from my phone to my laptop and labeling it with the date and location. I didn't know yet what I'd need it for. But I knew I'd need it. The city lights filtered through our bedroom windows, and I sat there in the dark, documenting everything while Weston slept peacefully beside me, completely unaware that I was building a case he couldn't imagine. His breathing was steady, undisturbed, while I worked in silence. The first email I sent came 2 weeks after the gala. It was professional, calm, and deliberately vague. I addressed it to the family office manager, a man named Terrence, who handled day-to-day operations for the Alder Foundation. Terrence had been with the family for 15 years, loyal to a fault. The subject line read, "Compliance Clarification, Expense Classifications." Inside, I asked a series of neutral questions about how certain foundation expenses were being categorized. Nothing accusatory. Just policy. The kind of questions someone with fiduciary oversight is supposed to ask. I attached a copy of the Foundation's governance charter for reference. Then I sent it and waited. No one replied. Not Terrence. Not the accountant. Not Weston, who was copied on the email as a trustee. Silence is its own kind of answer. And I saved the sent email in my folder under a new subfolder, Ignored Compliance Requests. I sent a follow-up 2 weeks later. Still no response. That silence told me everything I needed to know about how seriously they took oversight when it came from me. They thought I was asking questions to feel important, to justify my position. They had no idea I was building a record. 3 weeks later, Brenna posted photos in the private family group chat. She was lounging by a pool with a drink in her hand, the ocean stretching out behind her in that particular shade of turquoise you only see in expensive places. Her sunglasses probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. The caption read, "Foundation Retreat Winking Face." Kimber replied with a string of flame emojis. Dorian sent a photo of himself on a jet ski, spray kicking up behind him. Lenora commented about how hard they all worked and how much they deserved the break. I scrolled through the thread without reacting, my face carefully neutral even though I was alone in my apartment. Then I opened the Foundation's most recent expense report and found the line item I'd been looking for, Executive Team Strategic Planning, Cabo San Lucas. The amount matched the villa rental Brenna had tagged in her Instagram story. I took screenshots of the texts, the Instagram post, and the expense report. Then I filed them all together in a subfolder labeled, Charitable Misuse, Documented. The timestamps on everything would be crucial later. I made sure each file was dated and cross-referenced. Details mattered. Details always mattered. I'd learned that from Callum Alder's own writings about how he'd built his fortune. I had lunch with an attorney I'd met at a governance and ethics seminar 6 months earlier. Her name was Sloane Breckenridge, and she specialized in trust law and fiduciary disputes. She had an office in a building that smelled like old money and new carpeting. I didn't tell her I was gathering evidence. I just asked questions. Hypothetical ones. What happens when fiduciary misuse is documented but tolerated inside a marriage? I'd asked, cutting into a salad I wasn't really eating. She'd looked at me carefully, the way lawyers do when they know you're not asking hypothetically at all. Her eyes were sharp behind designer glasses. If you're married to someone with fiduciary authority, you have discretion, she'd said. You can advise. You can document. But you're not required to act. However, if that changes, if you're no longer married, everything you know becomes something you're legally obligated to report. I'd nodded slowly, letting that sink in. And if someone had been documenting for a while? Sloane had set down her fork. Then they'd have a very strong case. I paid the bill and thanked her for her time. She handed me her card as I left. I already had it, but I took it anyway. On the back, she'd written her personal cell number in neat script. Just in case, she'd said. I understood what she meant. The truth about the Alder family fortune was something most people didn't understand. Weston was the heir. His name was on the letterhead. He gave speeches at foundation events and smiled for press photos. Articles in business magazines mentioned him by name. But control and ownership weren't the same thing. Weston's grandfather, Callum Alder, had built the family's wealth through shipping and logistics, starting with a single warehouse in 1952 and building an empire that spanned 3 decades. Then he'd structured the trust in a way that protected it from future generations' egos and mistakes. He'd seen too many families destroy themselves fighting over money. So he'd separated authority from access. Signing power from spending power. The trust required 2 signatures for any major transaction. One from a family trustee. One from a designated fiduciary oversight administrator. Weston was the trustee. I was the administrator. They all thought that was a formality. A nice gesture to make me feel included. What they didn't realize was that Callum Alder hadn't believed in gestures. Every line in that trust document had teeth. And I'd read every single line multiple times, understanding exactly what power I held while they assumed I held none. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sunday dinners at the Alder estate were mandatory. Not officially, but in the way things are mandatory when it means weeks of passive-aggressive comments and pointed silences. I went because it was easier than explaining why I wouldn't. That particular Sunday, we were sitting in the formal dining room with its long table and uncomfortable chairs that cost more than most people's cars. The chandelier above us had been imported from France. My father-in-law, Garrick, was holding court at the head of the table, telling some story about a deal he'd closed in the 80s. He paused mid-sentence, looked at me, and smiled in that way that wasn't really a smile. Must be nice to be the quiet dependent, he'd said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Weston had laughed. So had Dorian. Kimber smirked into her wine glass. I'd smiled back and taken a sip of water. Then I'd memorized the exact wording and filed it away mentally in the same folder where I kept everything else. Later that night, I added it to my documentation with the date, time, and witnesses present. The chicken had been dry, and the conversation had been worse, but the documentation was perfect. I was building something they couldn't see, wouldn't understand until it was too late. The second compliance email I sent was more specific. I cited 3 separate instances of expense misclassification. I included policy references from the Foundation Charter, complete with section numbers and page citations. I attached receipts that didn't match their reported purposes. A spa treatment categorized as a business meeting. A private jet charter was listed as donor relations when no donors had been on board. I requested clarification and correction within 14 business days. This time, I didn't copy Weston. I sent it directly to Terence, the board treasurer, and the external auditing firm that was supposed to be conducting annual reviews. Then I waited. 14 days passed. No one replied. No one corrected anything. No one even acknowledged receipt. That mattered more than if they'd argued. Silence wasn't ignorance. It was a choice. And every choice they made was building my case brick by brick. I sent a third email, this one with a read receipt request. It was opened within an hour. Still no response. They were choosing to ignore formal compliance inquiries from the fiduciary administrator. That pattern would matter later. That pattern would matter in court. Weston told me over breakfast on a Tuesday that his parents thought we'd grown apart. He said it casually, like he was commenting on the weather, while spreading jam on toast. The morning light came through our windows, making everything look deceptively peaceful. They think maybe we rushed into things, he'd added, not meeting my eyes. I'd looked up from my coffee. Do you think we rushed into things? He'd hesitated just long enough for me to know the answer. I think we're different people than we were 3 years ago. 2 weeks later, he filed for divorce. His attorney called mine with an offer. A settlement. A reasonable one, they said. Enough to be comfortable. Enough to go away quietly. I didn't respond immediately. I let them think I was considering it. Meanwhile, the family group chat lit up with congratulations. Lenora, so proud of you for making a hard choice. Brenna, new chapter. Kimber sent a gif of someone popping champagne. I saved every message. Every single one. Then I called Sloane Breckenridge and told her it was time. She'd been waiting for my call. I'll file the paperwork tomorrow, she said. Once the divorce is filed, the clock starts. I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. She knew what was coming. Sloane had said it gently, but the words landed like a hammer. Now you're legally required to act on everything you documented. We were sitting in her office, the city spread out behind her through floor-to-ceiling windows. She'd reviewed my folder. All of it. Every file, every recording, every receipt. It had taken her 3 hours to go through everything. As long as you were married, you had discretion, she'd explained. You could advise internally, document concerns, but you weren't required to report. But now that you're divorcing, you're no longer protected by spousal privilege. Everything you know about fiduciary misuse, you're obligated to report. If you don't, you become complicit. I'd nodded slowly. I already know. She'd looked at me with something close to respect. How long have you been planning this? I'd thought about that gala, that first recording, the way Lenora's laughter had echoed in that ballroom. Since the beginning. She smiled. Good. Let's make sure we do this perfectly. We spent the next 4 hours going through every document, every timestamp, building an absolutely airtight timeline. By the time we finished, the sun was setting over the city. I submitted the full compliance report on a Monday morning. It was 63 pages long, with another 200 pages of supporting documentation. Every file from my folder, organized chronologically and cross-referenced with foundation bylaws and IRS regulations. Gala recordings with timestamps. Expense receipts with highlighted discrepancies. Text message screenshots showing awareness of misuse. Emails showing ignored compliance requests. I included a detailed executive summary that laid out the pattern of behavior over 14 months. I sent it to the Foundation's oversight board, the external trustees who weren't family, and the legal team that handled the trust's governance. No emotion. No accusations. Just dates, facts, and policy violations. Then I closed my laptop and made tea while I waited for the phone to start ringing. I didn't have to wait long. The first call came at 10:15. I let it go to voicemail. So did the next 6 calls that followed. I was done explaining myself to people who'd never listened. I sipped my tea and watched the phone light up again. The first freeze happened the next morning. Certain foundation accounts required secondary authorization to process transactions. Without my signature, nothing moved. Brenna tried to pay for a spa retreat she'd scheduled for the executive wellness team. The payment was declined. Kimber's corporate card stopped working at a restaurant where she was having lunch with friends. Dorian couldn't access the discretionary fund he'd been using for personal travel. They all assumed it was a bank error. Some technical glitch that would be resolved with a phone call. It wasn't. Every account I'd flagged in my report had been placed under temporary restriction pending review. They just didn't know that yet. The external trustees had moved faster than I'd expected. They'd seen the evidence and acted immediately. That told me everything I needed to know about how bad the misuse had been. If they were moving this quickly, the violations were even worse than I'd documented. I'd only captured what I could see. Who knew what else was buried in the foundation's records? My phone rang all day. Weston called twice. Lenora called 3 times. Even Garrick, who never called anyone, left a voicemail asking me to call the bank. Brenna sent me texts, "Something's wrong with the foundation account. Can you fix this?" Maris, seriously, call me. I replied only once, to all of them, with the same message, "Please contact the compliance office for any account inquiries." Then I silenced my phone and went for a walk through Riverside Park. The trees were just starting to change color, and the air was cool enough to need a jacket. I bought a coffee from a cart run by a man who'd been there for years and sat on a bench, watching joggers and dog walkers pass. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like I could breathe. The weight I'd been carrying, the weight they'd called me, had lifted. I sat there for an hour, just breathing and watching the world move around me while their world started to crumble. A woman threw a ball for her golden retriever. A couple walked hand in hand. Life continued, indifferent to the Alder family drama. The letters arrived the following week. IRS inquiry notices regarding potential charitable misuse and unreported personal benefits. Each family member received one. The envelopes were official, imposing. Weston called me from his attorney's office, his voice tight with something between panic and fury. "Did you do this?" he'd asked. I reported what I'm legally required to report, I'd said calmly. "Your family has been misusing foundation assets for personal expenses." I documented it. I asked for corrections. I was ignored. Now it's out of my hands. There was a long silence. I could hear him breathing, could imagine him sitting in that expensive office trying to process what was happening. They're talking about an audit. That's standard procedure when misuse is reported. "Maris, this is going to destroy." I'd hung up before he finished the sentence. Whatever he thought would be destroyed wasn't my responsibility to protect anymore. My only responsibility was to the trust Callum Alder had created, the one his grandson and his family had treated like their personal piggy bank. An hour later, Sloan called. The IRS moved faster than expected. This must be worse than we thought. I looked out my window at the city below. I documented what I saw. If it's worse, that's on them. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for a Friday afternoon. I received the invitation as a technical formality since I was still listed as the fiduciary oversight administrator until the divorce was finalized. The family didn't think I'd attend. They probably thought I'd hide, that I'd be embarrassed, that I'd want to avoid the confrontation. I arrived 10 minutes early in a navy suit I'd bought specifically for the occasion. Professional. Unremarkable. I carried a leather portfolio that contained copies of everything I'd already submitted. I took a seat at the conference table and waited. When Lenora walked in and saw me, her face went white. All the color drained from her carefully made-up features. Weston stopped in the doorway. Garrick's jaw tightened. Brenna looked at Kimber like she was expecting someone to explain what was happening. I folded my hands on the table and waited for the meeting to start. I'd prepared for this moment for 14 months. I was ready. They were not. The room smelled like expensive wood polish and fear. The board chairman, an external trustee named Dalton Mosby, called the meeting to order. He was a retired federal judge, 76 years old, with silver hair and no patience for nonsense. We're here to review the compliance report submitted by Administrator Maris Glenmore regarding potential misuse of charitable assets, he'd said, his voice flat and official. Then he'd looked at me. Mrs. Glenmore, you have the floor. I'd stood and walked to the presentation screen. I didn't need notes. I'd lived this documentation for over a year. I started with the gala recording. Lenora's voice filled the conference room, making that joke about me retiring into luxury. I watched her face as she heard her own words played back. Then I showed the Cabo receipts next to the foundation expense report. The numbers matched perfectly. The Instagram posts next to the charitable mission statement. The contradiction was stark. The text messages where they joked about using foundation money for personal trips. I played a voicemail where Garrick told Weston to move some foundation funds around to cover a bad investment. His voice echoed in the silent room. I showed emails where I'd asked for clarification and been ignored. 3 emails. 0 responses. I displayed the dead weight text message on the screen, enlarged so everyone could read it clearly. Not because I was hurt. But it demonstrated a culture of negligence toward oversight and accountability. No one interrupted me. When I finished, I sat down. The room was completely silent. Then Dalton cleared his throat. Thank you, Mrs. Glenmore. That was very thorough. The board voted that afternoon. Signing authority was suspended immediately for all family members pending a full external audit. Temporarily, they said. But we all knew what temporary meant in situations like this. Within a week, the decision was made permanent. Lenora, Garrick, Weston, Brenna, Dorian, and Kimber were all removed from any financial decision-making authority within the foundation. They could attend meetings. They could make recommendations. But they couldn't move money. Couldn't approve expenses. Couldn't access accounts. Everything now required approval from the external board and from me. The dead weight was suddenly holding all the weight they'd pretended didn't exist. Dalton called me personally that evening. I want to apologize, he said. We should have been paying closer attention. Your compliance emails should never have been ignored. I thanked him and said nothing else. The apology didn't matter. What mattered was that the foundation would finally operate the way Callum Alder had intended. The way it should have been operating all along. The social fallout was quieter but just as devastating. Invitations slowed to a trickle, then stopped. Fundraiser committees suddenly had filled positions. People who'd smiled at them for years started returning calls a day late or not at all. In their world, reputation was currency. And an IRS investigation into charitable misuse was a scarlet letter. Money without credibility isn't power. It's radioactive. People don't want to be near it when it implodes. I watched it happen from a distance, the way you watch a building being demolished in slow motion. Carefully. Methodically. One floor at a time. Brenna stopped posting on social media entirely. Her Instagram went dark. Kimber's accounts went private. Lenora canceled her annual garden party for the first time in 20 years. The whispers were loud enough to hear even when people thought they were being discreet. I didn't take pleasure in it. But I didn't feel guilty either. They'd built this house of cards themselves. Weston came to my apartment 3 months after the board meeting. He'd lost weight. There were circles under his eyes. He stood in my doorway like he wasn't sure he was allowed to come in. "Can we talk?" he'd asked. His voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. I'd let him in, offered him coffee. He'd refused. We sat in my living room, the space between us heavy with everything unsaid. "Can you fix this quietly?" he'd finally said. "Tell the board it was a misunderstanding. That you overreacted. They'll listen to you." I'd looked at him for a long moment. This man I'd married. This man, who'd kissed my forehead and told me not to be sensitive. This man, who'd let his family call me dead weight and never once defended me. "This is me doing my job," I'd said quietly. "The job your grandfather gave me when he set up that trust. The job you all thought was decorative." He'd stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "I didn't know you were capable of this." "I know," I'd said. That was the problem. He left without finishing the coffee I'd made. I poured it down the sink and watched him from my window as he walked to his car. He looked smaller somehow. Diminished. I felt nothing watching him go. The legal filings became public record 4 months into the divorce proceedings. Weston's attorney tried to argue that I'd acted vindicatively, that I'd weaponized my position out of spite. My attorney submitted the documentation timeline. Showed that I'd been flagging issues for over a year before the divorce was even mentioned. Showed the ignored emails, the unanswered compliance requests. Showed that I'd given them every opportunity to correct course before it became a legal matter. The family's own text messages were quoted in court filings. Word for word. "Dead weight. She doesn't do anything. Good thing Weston handles the real money." The judge hadn't looked impressed. "It appears," the judge said, reading from the timeline, "that Mrs. Glenmore attempted repeatedly to address these issues through proper channels and was consistently ignored. This is not vindictive behavior. This is proper fiduciary responsibility." Weston's attorney had no response to that. The courtroom was silent except for the scratch of the court reporter's keyboard. The trust restructuring hearing happened on a cold Tuesday in November. I sat at the front table with Sloan and the external trustees. The Alder family sat 3 rows back with their attorney, looking smaller somehow than they had at those Sunday dinners in their formal dining room. The judge reviewed the documentation, the audit results, the compliance violations. The audit had uncovered even more than I'd documented. Then he'd looked at the family and said something I'll never forget: "The purpose of a trust is to protect assets for their intended use. When beneficiaries treat oversight as optional, they forfeit the privilege of control." This court finds that the external board and administrator Glenmore acted appropriately and in accordance with the trust's founding documents. The restructuring was approved. I remained as fiduciary administrator with expanded authority. The family's access was limited to approved distributions, all subject to external review. Callum Alder's trust was working exactly as he'd designed it. Protecting the money from the people who thought their last name meant they owned it. As we filed out of the courtroom, Lenora tried to approach me. Sloan stepped between us. "All communication goes through attorneys," she said firmly. Lenora's eyes were red, but I felt no sympathy. She'd had over a year to respond to my compliance emails. She'd chosen silence then. She didn't get to choose the conversation now. 2 years later, I'm sitting in a conference room on the 43rd floor, signing off on a $300 million reallocation into sustainable infrastructure projects. The foundation's assets have grown by 22% since the restructuring. We're funding clean water initiatives in developing countries, educational programs in underserved communities, and medical research that could change lives. Real work. Transparent work. The kind of work Callum Alder intended when he built this fortune. I chair the Ethical Investment Board now. We meet quarterly. The family isn't invited. Sometimes I think about that screenshot. The one that started everything, or at least made it impossible to ignore. Dead weight. I keep it in a folder on my desktop. Not because I'm angry, but because it reminds me of something important. It reminds me that silence can be strategic. That documentation is power. That being underestimated is sometimes the greatest advantage you can have. I learned that from them. They taught me well. I was cleaning out old files last month when I opened that folder again. The original documentation, Alder family folder with all its subfolders and timestamps. I scrolled through the recordings, the receipts, the emails that were never answered. 14 months of quiet collection. Patient documentation. I thought about Lenora at that gala, laughing into a microphone while making jokes at my expense. About Garrick calling me the quiet dependent at Sunday dinner. About Weston kissing my forehead and telling me I was taken care of. They'd all believed their own story so completely. That I was decorative. Dependent. Lucky to be there. What they never understood was that the only weight I'd ever carried was them. Their egos. Their carelessness. Their certainty that oversight was optional when you had the right last name. I closed the folder and archived it. I don't need it anymore. The foundation is running the way it should. Clean. Accountable. Effective. And somewhere in a downtown law office, there's a file that proves what happens when people mistake quiet for weak. When they assume that the person they underestimated wasn't just watching. She was building a case. One screenshot at a time. The dead weight had been them all along. And I'd finally put it down.